Bruce to Torres. We have a friendship that I call serendipity doodah. When you have serendipity, it's good, but when you have a really good one, it's serendipity doodah. And we ran into each other and resonated very, very well. You have a remarkable history of your vocation and your hobbies and so on. And having read your book, I find you to be a very rare person in that you tend to be very competent both in left and right brain functions. You balance so well between logical and mechanical versus creative and emotional. And that means that people who are conceptually sensitive deal with you well, and also people who are rationally objective. And your book, God's School, 9/11, and JFK are remarkable in that in 175 pages, you have really given a very deep dive without choking people with information. Plus, unlike many authors, you have 45 source pages and a complete index. So you throw breadcrumbs down and then show people exactly where to go. And I find that, a person could either blast through your book quickly or savor it, sit down with a single malt scotch and enjoy bit by bit. And I have to say, and I've told you this a couple of times, the most compelling quote I found in your book on page 9 says, "Our urges must be examined and comprehended and self-control acquired if we would live together in peace. Peace requires trust. Trust requires truth." Bruce, I'm a better person for having read your book, and that pushes me even further into feeling like I need to be in action to help influence people to be more informed and more in action. So thanks, Bruce, for being here. Please tell us more about yourself, won't you?
My pleasure, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, Peter. And I feel the exact same way about you. And what I want to say about me is kind of woven into the presentation. So I'm going to share a screen and get this thing started. You see my PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
We can.
All right, here we go. The truth about JFK sets us free, I say. And at his inaugural, he said, "We dare not forget we are the heirs of that first revolution, the American Revolution, before which Patrick Henry said, 'Give me liberty or give me death.'" That's what President Kennedy implied we ought to always remember. And what made him him? What gave Kennedy the ability to do and be what he did and what he was? His father was a tremendous, deep influence. We're going to talk about him a little bit. And his other lifelong friend was the knowledge that he might drop dead any second due to his health problems. And then, as things got interesting by 1963, the death threats that were starting to swirl closer and closer to him. And to study his assassination is to discover not only the truth about it, but also him and his greatness. And it is motivating and invigorating, and now more than ever, as probably humanity always needed to. We need to clarify the issues at stake: liberty or death. And my new book, my first book, just came out this year. Please read the amazing reviews at brucetotorres.com. You can get it at trineday.com, published by Chris Milligan. And for the last 15 months, every week, I help Chris record a podcast episode with many of his past authors. It's been an incredible curriculum. And at trineday.com, you can hear all the episodes, also at my site. They're each about a half hour long. We've seen a number of his authors speak in this conference, including Judy. So dig into Trine Day, ladies and gentlemen. If you want to empower anybody with the truth, get my book and check out all of Trine Day's offerings. My life could easily be called Reading Interrupted. When I was in the first grade, the first grade teacher said, "You're a good reader," and she advanced me to a higher level group. And that was my first identity. And I ingested that very much as a conscious suggestion. So, and Lincoln was one of my first fascinations, and reading, whatever was appropriate for grade school, and then the rest of my life. And I decided to be an actor when I was in the 6th grade. So I read and read and read about show business and what makes someone great. First, what makes someone great as an actor. And I had a breakthrough. Chris Milligan said books change people's lives all the time. In my 30s, way back in the 1990s, I read Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. Thoughts become things. Everything's made out of energy. I had a great aha about that, and read deeply into that and consciousness, and decided I was going to write a book just about that, and started entrepreneurial activities because I put the acting career on pause, and studied marketing and sales and public speaking and practice. I love to obsess about what I am interested in. And then 9/11 happened, and someone tipped me off and said, that official story is not what it seems like. And had my mind blown discovering after 2004, 9/11. And by 2014, I had prepared a series of talks for an open microphone where I was going to once a week just to keep comfortable on stage in a little divey bar. It was wonderful. And at the 10-year anniversary of 9/11 in 2011, I did a series of talks there about 9/11. And then in 2013 for the 50th anniversary. And then in 2014, I decided to write all that up, everything I had read about what's going on behind the scenes, and surrounded with what I had conceived about energy and consciousness and the nature of existence, because I believe those truths set us free. Not only the truths about these major areas in my book and the American history I cover in the book, but also the truth of our nature. And we'll talk about why that is so important. So President Kennedy loved America, and he loved the American dream because he lived it. His father, he was the descendant of immigrants and had risen to the top of the top. So to understand how did Kennedy face what he did and how could he push through and persevere, it's amazing to imagine and to see what we can learn, but also even then imagine how did he incorporate what was this inspiration of this man. This man was a human being like all of us, with his strengths and weaknesses and his courage and his cowardice, just like all of us. So what did John F. Kennedy take from this man? Well, there's a joy of living, and there's also a pursuit of excellence that infused the whole clan and still does. Be the best, win. And there's nothing automatically brutal or selfish about that. It's fun to compete. It's fun to study what is excellence, what is the best. And as you read about Kennedy's life, everything he said and how he approached things, that was a very, very high bar that they aspired to. And yet he was made of defective stuff. He might have thought about himself, spent a lot of time sick, in bed, reading, and near death, starting from when he was 2 years old. And had to contemplate, what's this all about? How am I going to live my life? And in the lower right, you see him autographing a copy of a book. His first book that he had written just a couple years out of college, with a lot of help from his father's influential friends, for movie star Spencer Tracy. So it's an example, I like to imagine, of him leveraging all he had thought about what makes a successful person, and was able to crunch a book to be valid enough to be taken seriously as a bestseller, for whatever help the father may have helped with his business connections. an example of making lemonade out of lemons. He was rejected for service. His father pulled strings. He got into the Navy. He was relegated to safe desk job and had more strings pulled in order to get into active service. This frail, probably pain-ridden already by these years, man pushed his way to command a PT boat, which bounces on the waves like a bucking bronco. That couldn't feel good to a healthy person, let alone someone in his condition, and got cut in half by a Japanese ship. So once again, was confronting his old friend death. And again, lemonade out of lemons. 1946, an article about his exploits appeared. He was able to leverage that year, also with help from his father, into becoming a congressman. And he was lucky enough to meet Dave Powers, and continuing his enjoyment and need for levity and enjoyment. And later in his life, Kennedy told friends, the trick is to live each day as if it's your last. And nobody squeezed in more life, more adventures, more intense hard work than he did. And by the early 1950s, he threw his hat in the ring and worked hard to become senator in Massachusetts, when everyone was telling him, wait your turn, you're too young, and he knew, because of his imminent death, his fear of death, his awareness of his fragile health. No, I have to do it now if I'm going to do it at all. His brother Robert there, mock posing, laughing at the idea of John F. Kennedy for United States Senator. I love how they did that. That wasn't probably for a public release. He was lucky enough to attract, meet, and appreciate Ted Sorensen, young lawyer, and they combined to create prose that is worthy of Jefferson and what our founders had written and what Abraham Lincoln had written. And yet, no sooner was he senator than again, he had major health problems that brought him to the brink a couple of times in 54, 55, made lemonade out of lemons again, writing Profiles in Courage, big bestseller, Pulitzer Prize, almost became the vice presidential candidate in 1956, and made the decision on pursuing the presidency in 1960. Another example of courage were his remarks in the Senate about Algeria and how France was on the wrong side of history. And that was a very bold statement to make, pursuing the nomination, but it differentiated himself. He knew what he was doing. And also he had to live up to his brand, which is that I'm brave and I've got endurance. That's what the PT 109 adventure, he was able to wrap himself in, and he walked the talk. Because in this day and age, when so much talk is cheap, the more you look at President Kennedy, the more you find he was the real deal. And this is the coconut that he used to help save him and his men from that ordeal of 9 or 10 days with very little water, very little food. And it is a memento mori, which we have been looking at all along. Remember, you are mortal. Remember, you're going to die. And for him, he didn't know if it was going to be next week or next month or today. There were some evaluations of his health that he might not walk. He might be in a wheelchair soon, and other things. So it empowered him. This is how he was able to have the courage to face forces that kill to win against the military-industrial complex and the intelligence world, and he became president. I love that he insisted on top hats and tails for his inauguration. He's a man who didn't wear hats when most men did. It was a unique kind of quirky thing. And yet for his inaugural, he decreed top hats. And you find this picture in biographies of him, he and his school chums lampooning a hit song, Top Hat. We're putting on our top hat, tying up our white tie, brushing off our tails by Fred Astaire. And I just love the idea that with these top hats, he was tickling these old friends and how much fun they had back in their school days, singing and dancing that hit song. 1961, the year of disasters, as he called it by the end, started with Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union pledging to support wars of liberation, which would bring them into direct conflict with the United States foreign policy. Eisenhower, 3 days before Kennedy became president, warning the world, and I think especially President Kennedy, against the military-industrial complex, against the potential for control of technology by an elite that will dictate policy, and also not going into debt and mortgaging our children's future so we don't become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow. And we'll see how Kennedy stood in the way of those things and how those three arguably have been fulfilled in their worst aspects. In his first couple of months, Allen Dulles of the CIA and Lemnitzer, the Joint Chiefs Chairman, lied to him about the prospects of success for the Cuban exiles' invasion at the Bay of Pigs. And he was humiliated in front of the world and had his mind blown. Kennedy said to those around him, "How could I have been so stupid? How could I have believed these guys whom I didn't know personally just because they were supposed to be experts?" Making lemonade out of lemons. 1 month later, he tells Congress that the United States should put a man on the moon, get him back safely by the end of the year. I wonder if he didn't need a big distracting story after the humiliation of the Bay of Pigs, whether that goal would have been embraced so soon and so boldly. He met with Khrushchev, and Khrushchev said, "We're going to try to push you out, essentially, of West Berlin by the end of the year." And Kennedy came home and spoke to the nation and said, "We're in a big crisis." And he asked for a lot more funds, and he called up the reserves. And he said, "We don't know how this is going to end, but we may end up in direct nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union." And at the bottom, you see the Berlin Wall that the Soviets built around West Berlin. Toward the end of the year, in September, Kennedy spoke to the United Nations and challenged the Soviet Union to a peace race. And he talked about disarmament. And that's something we haven't heard about really since the early 60s. And because the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about. So 1961 was a terribly tense year. But in October, the Soviet Union blew up a 50 megaton bomb, and our tanks and theirs faced each other at Checkpoint Charlie. And Kennedy in November, December, had a member of his administration, mid-ranking, in a speech, I think, in the Midwest to either a university audience or to members of the press. He revealed that our nuclear superiority is many times larger than the Soviet Union's, because Khrushchev was winning kind of the propaganda battle, positioning himself as an equal. And Kennedy said, "Well, that's it. Let the world know." And I think that in large part helped persuade Khrushchev to make the decision to put nuclear weapons into Cuba the next year. I think John Newman recently spoke about his research that's found that the Joint Chiefs and the intelligence community here knew about the Soviet nuclear beginning of their buildup early in 62, maybe March and April, way before October, when the current history says, and President Kennedy was the first to be told, "What? There's nuclear weapons on Cuba." Operation Northwoods, where they proposed to him, "Hey, why don't we do all these acts of terrorism, blame it on the Soviet Union, blame it on Cuba as an excuse to go into Cuba." People who think that the United States wouldn't do things like that for 9/11, really, like 9/11, really ought to look at Operation Northwoods. And this Soviet officer was in a submarine around the waters in Cuba when his commander on the ship thought they were being attacked because of what depth charges I think the United States was dropping. And 2 of the 3 officers wanted to launch their nuclear weapons on their submarine, which probably would have caused the earth incinerating exchange. But Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov, whose agreement was required, said no. So you and I might be having this conversation because this young man said no. 1963, Norman Cousins came back from talking to Khrushchev and told Kennedy, Khrushchev is willing to talk seriously about improving relationships. And within a few weeks, Kennedy gave his peace speech at American University and talked about ending the Cold War and disarmament announced the upcoming negotiations to develop a limited a test ban treaty, and they got every area except underground, so it was limited. And that was he was riding the popularity of his quote unquote winning the Cuban Missile Crisis and amazing acts of courage. He went on television to announce he was asking Congress for a comprehensive civil rights bill, knowing this might cost him re-election in '64. And he went to Europe, and the more he talked about peace, the more the crowds grew, and he saw that the whole world was really happy with how the Cuban Missile Crisis resolved. And Kennedy set himself on course, by all indications, to reach détente, peace with the Soviet Union, end the Cold War. And by the time he talked to this UN again in September, he was describing how, and also in his peace speech, the elimination of war and arms is in the interest of all. So the military industrial complex was hearing that the president had the goal of eliminating arms and armament, probably, obviously keep enough for defense, but to radically change the direction that we've been going in since the end of World War II. The test ban treaty was signed in September and October, and this is this order, National Security Action Memorandum, declaring that 1,000 U.S. personnel will be withdrawn from South Vietnam by the end of the year, with the bulk hopefully by the end of 1965. Kennedy told a lot of folks around him there's no way he's putting ground troops into Vietnam. And he stood through during some of a motorcade in Tampa when he knew that there had recently been an assassination plot in that city. And that's a book by Abraham Bolden talking about the earlier plot in Chicago a couple of weeks earlier. And on his last night in Texas, he told his wife, "Did you see that guy approach us? You know how easily he could have shot me with a pistol?" And the next morning, they saw a handbill or something in the paper talking about how much Dallas was out to get him. And they must have been discussing assassination again. And he said something like, "Look, if someone is willing to shoot me is going to shoot me with a rifle from a building, there's nothing anyone can do about it. So why worry about it?" And it goes, there's a lot that he did and said about death and assassinations in his last few months. And these comments and encounters with Jackie, it make me think that, was he pre-comforting her? Was he showing her that he was wide awake to the threats that he faced? So should something happen, she would have some kind of solace knowing he wasn't that ambushed. He said in Profiles in Courage, a person does what they must. That's all there is to human morality, despite the obstacles. And that's how he was very much the real deal. And he got in a limo and went through Dallas. And we know what happened there. This is the classic 3-act structure of a story. And you can plot into this basically the beginning, middle, and end of many stories, especially screenplays. And for instance, in The Wizard of Oz, in Act 1, you meet your nemesis, okay? And then there's a plot point at the end of Act 1 that throws the story in a completely different direction. Of course, in Oz, it's the tornado that throws our hero, Dorothy, into a whole chaotic adventure. And the suspense and the thrills are everything that the hero in their journey has to go through to make sense of it and find a way and have a huge transformation to pursue what they want. And you don't know how it's going to end. The plot point at the end of Act 2 in Oz is melting the witch, throwing the water to save her burning scarecrow friend. And that sets up the denouement, the descent into the real ending where, wow, she had the way to get home all along on her feet. And she gets home, and that's Oz. Now, America. We meet our nemesis in 1832. The Order of Skull and Bones is formed at Yale. And they stand for not only their own massive influence, infiltration, and manipulation of America since then, but for all the secret societies and all the machinations behind the scenes. And we were balanced between state and federal power until Lincoln and the Civil War was that turning point that threw us into a completely different direction. And throughout Act 2, you had you had corporations honored now with the rights of individuals, and you had the formation of the Federal Reserve, and you had the new federal income tax of arguable constitutionality, and you have World War I and you have World War II, and you can read Trine books to see how from behind the scenes these things have been inflicted on us to take advantage of human beings who'd rather be free. And the plot point at the end of Act Two is Kennedy, his assassination, his administration, and let's see how America ends. He gave 64 press conferences throughout his presidency, about 2 a month. And that created such familiarity with him. That's probably why the American people were so wounded, and the world was so wounded by his assassination. And it's not just because he, like Chris Milligan said Friday, it's not just because he pissed off some people in 1962. It was a long time coming, especially when you read Royal Vengeance and the Valediction, that give the background in general terms of what Chris was talking about, the killing of the king, how it was a public sacrifice. We were meant to have the father figure, which is the king, brutally murdered so that we would feel completely powerless, disoriented, basically chopping our head off. If you cut you kill the king, you cut the head off of a country and it staggers around. And he was also America's high watermark. He's the climax at the end of Act Two. He's also America's high watermark in terms of fulfilling the ideals of the founding. And then there was Johnson and Vietnam, and Johnson knowing and or maybe causing Israel to attack the Liberty. They were going to blame it on Egypt, and they were going to nuke Egypt, but it went wrong, and that didn't get fulfilled, thank God. Martin Luther King was killed. Bobby Kennedy was killed by conspiracies, read Lisa Peace's books, read the other experts who've done the research on Martin Luther King. And then we get Nixon, okay, who convinced the South Vietnamese, don't make peace in 1968. I'll get you a better deal. And then that was prolonged another 4 or 5 years. And half of the casualties followed Nixon's interference and not allowing peace in Vietnam to happen by 68. Carter, under the sway of Brzezinski and the Rockefeller forces, to lure the Soviet Union into Afghanistan to justify our completely unnecessary military buildup and the artificial extension of the Cold War, which could have ended back in 64 or 65. 2 or 3 months into his presidency, Reagan takes a bullet, tons to indicate the connections of the Bush family behind and around that. Yes. He was a member of Skull and Bones. And as Andrew Craig just said, Bill Clinton, another operative, proving his bona fides to the intelligence community. We had Waco, we had Oklahoma City. And these traumas are great to make us allow and beg the government get stronger and stronger to protect us from all the enemies around us. And 9/11 under the presidency of George W., also Skull and Bones, and World Trade Center 7 announced as having collapsed. 20 minutes before it collapsed, there it is over the shoulder. She jumped the script. She was given the script too soon. Building 7, nice into its own footprint. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this audience probably knows that 3 buildings collapsed in New York, the third of which wasn't hit by a plane. And there's nothing right about the physics of that. Major chapter in my book, 9/11, talking about the clown act that story is, leading to our war on terror and the recultivation of the poppy fields in Afghanistan, and supposedly trustworthy leaders like Colin Powell at the UN lying his face off about the weapons of mass destruction that Iraq has. And boom, there it is. US Patriot Act and the Department of Homeland Security. So after Kennedy, how did Act 3 end? With 9/11 and the boot that Orwell warned us about on our face forever unless we do something about it. That is Bruce's version of America in 3 acts, plotted into the 3-act structure. Because after the Patriot Act and Homeland Security, we don't live under the Constitution anymore. America is over. America exists. This is America in one picture. America exists where people live under the Constitution, where the government protects their rights under the Constitution. That's not here. If it's going to be, it's got to be real. We've got to force our representatives to honor the Constitution. It's not good enough just to have someone put their hand on the Bible and say the words. That's called acting. And the forces against us have trillions of dollars to hire the casts, write the scripts, and find the sets and blow them up to create the impression that the mainstream has on us. And those are lies that are killing us. And we now have this. What's this? What's this? What's the nature of the illness? What's the nature of the so-called cure? Huge, huge questions. Could be just another false flag created to do to us what's being done to us since. And another Kennedy, Bobby Jr., just came out with this book, The Real Anthony Fauci, and his latest speeches are eviscerating what we've done in the name of this illness. And we need to look at this like Randy Benson said the other day. We all need to be researchers. Otherwise, in my opinion, we're slaves if we just believe authority. This country is not supposed to be a country of people who blindly believe their leaders. So what can we do? We have to spread the word about JFK truth and the assassination, about 9/11, about the fallacies of organized religion and also the nature of reality. The lies that are killing us the lie is that we are poor, miserable sinners that deserve torture and punishment, that we are followers in school trained to just do what we're told. Those are lies. And the truth that sets us free is after you develop a spiritual imagination. Like, what spiritual imagination did John F. Kennedy had? I'd love to ask him. I like to imagine that I'll get a chance to, because like Anthony Chin Production on YouTube, these are interview after interview after interview with people who died, experienced amazing things, and came back. And what they described is often very, very similar. And it is so persuasive and so real to them that it's fun to imagine that every version of every event, this is also in quantum physics, the possibility that every version of every event always exists and is always happening. That it's some kind of a trick of perception that we experience one thing after another, linear time. Meaning, what happened to you in first grade is always happening. And as you pray for it and love it and have compassion like you can as an adult now for the confused, scared little kid you were, you help that situation. And also, with the version where you failed in your adventures, there's also infinite varieties of where you succeeded. And as we pull back and become mindful of all that might be around us, that we see painlessly when we do that transition that's called death, develop this imagination so that you can fall in love with life, so that you can stand in a limo in a city that probably has the assassination threat cleared and confidently be true to your values, like President Kennedy. Come what may, Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. And also fall in love with the Constitution. Like Peter alluded in this book, I've packed tons, because all I do is read. My life is reading interrupted. There's a chapter called A Brief History of the United States. And I evaluate for a new person. You don't have to read the dozens or the hundreds of books that I've read. And I'm not, so this is what we can do. These are the practical steps. Get the DVD of this conference or the previous conferences and spread the word. Do whatever it takes to spread the word and start conversations, to boldly and fearlessly explore with people who are that can hear your voice at holiday dinner tables or at work, And if they bristle and they're not open-minded, just say, oh, well, you know, that's a nice sweater you have on. We're not here to fight. We're not here to twist anyone's arm, but we are here to make our claim. We are here to plant our seeds. And I want to thank Judith for inviting me to participate in this conference. And I want to thank the crew, Randy and Peter and everyone else. And I'm going to make myself available for questions right now. It was an honor to yell at you for a little while here.
Bruce, can you hear us?
Yes.
This is Chanagel Willis. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I'll get with Pete offline to get hold of you. I wanted to add additional perspective on something. I'm not a researcher. I'm a witness. And my father was Master Chief Freddie Philman Spainhour. He was in Tulagi Bay with Kennedy during World War II before PT 109. He was enlisted. Kennedy was an officer, of course. And fast forward, his naval career took him into naval intelligence, and he was also, they did not know, CIA. He was involved in the assassination before, during, and after filming. And one thing he told me that's not on public record, and he's told this story so many times to me before he died at 91. Do you know what the Big E is, a USS Enterprise?
I've heard of it.
Okay, it was on its, it did some time over Cuba, and Dad led the photo recon on that from Jacksonville, Florida, where I was born. And Russia had agreed to pull out, America had agreed to pull out, and Kennedy became, started doing those peace talks you referenced about. And Dad was, they were going to take some pictures of the nuclear warheads on the deck and clear the airspace south of Florida, and asked all commercial airplanes to clear the airspace. And they had 2 blips come across the radar. McCain was on the same ship, John McCain, with my dad at that time. He had just started out his career. Dad was ending his career after 25 years. At that point, in January of '63, when the USS Enterprise was off Florida, 2 Russian MiGs flew over the deck of the Enterprise, 300 feet above the deck. There was nothing they could do. And it was at that point, they knew we were still in Cuban waters, and we knew they were still there. And Dad said it was at that point, the Enterprise made a mad dash to the Mediterranean to blockade Russian merchant ships that really had military on them. And that's when plans started, because he said to me, the plan was very afraid if the peace talks failed, that Kennedy would reveal our defense technologies that kept our country free. And they did not want folks to know that because of the military industrial complex.
Amazing. Amazing.
And so
Janet,
you were right on the mark about the military industrial complex being a catalyst for things that cascaded to Dallas. So I'll get with Pete offline and visit with you. Thank you for your, you did an excellent expose on Kennedy's entire life.
Thank you.
So we have any questions here popping up on Q&A? Where can people buy a copy of your book? Is it on Amazon?
Yes, it's on Amazon, and it's also at trineday.com.
Okay, and that's Chris Mulligan. And another question from Jane Jamar Clark is, what is your link? How do you link 9/11 and JFK?
Well, I describe them both as frauds. Those are both great strings to pull, because I want to reach the people who believe the mainstream official stories. So those two, I put those 2 stories front and center in my title as great tools for us to start conversations with others. That's how they're linked. Of course, in my 3-act structure, I show how their major significance in the course of American history.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.